She thought she was on a blind date with a plumber, but it was the city's most feared billionaire. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what's the worst lie someone has ever told you on a first date? And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy. Nora Wright took a sip of her lukewarm water and checked her phone for the 10th time. 7:15 p.m. The plumber was officially 15 minutes late. Her best friend Jessica, who had orchestrated this entire social experiment, had sworn he was different. He's solid, Nora. A real down-to-earth guy who works with his hands. No more tech bros or finance sharks, just a nice, normal plumber. A nice, normal, and very unpunctual plumber, Nora muttered to herself, already composing the scathing text she'd send Jessica later. She was just about to signal the waiter and call it a night when a man slid into the chair opposite her, slightly out of breath. "Nora, I'm so sorry. I'm River. Traffic was a nightmare." Nora looked up, ready to unleash a polite but firm lecture on the importance of time management, but the words died in her throat. This was not what she was expecting. Jessica's description, a bit rugged, think handsome lumberjack, had been a wild understatement. The man in front of her was handsome, yes, but not rugged. He was wearing a simple Henley shirt and jeans that looked suspiciously new, as if they'd been purchased an hour ago specifically for this role. And his hair, it was perfectly, effortlessly styled. "River," she said, recovering her composure and offering a small, tight smile. "The plumber." "That's me," he said, extending a hand across the table. She shook it, and that was the first clue. His hand was soft, impossibly soft. There were no calluses, no faint grease stains under the nails, no sign that this hand had ever wrestled with a rusty pipe. It was the hand of a man whose heaviest lifting involved a Mont Blanc pen. "So," Nora began, leaning back in her chair and giving him a slow, deliberate look. "You're a plumber. Must be a busy job. Lots of pipes." "Pipes, yes, lots of pipes," he confirmed, picking up his menu with a little too much enthusiasm. "Very tubular." Nora bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. "Tubular. Right. And what kind of plumbing do you specialize in? Residential? Commercial? Complicated pipe situations?" "Complicated pipe situations, exactly," he said, latching on to the gah. It wasn't flashy. It didn't scream, "Look at me." But Nora, a designer with an eye for detail, knew quality when she saw it. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The subtle sheen of the metal, the precision of the hands, that was not a watch a man who unclogs toilets for a living wore. "That's a beautiful watch," she said casually, mid-conversation. He instinctively pulled his sleeve down. "Oh, it's old. A gift." "From a grateful client, I assume?" she asked, her smile a little too sweet. "For fixing a particularly complicated pipe situation?" He laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "Something like that, yes." That's when Nora made a decision. She wasn't going to call him out. Not yet. This was far more interesting. For the first time in a year of dreadful blind dates, she was actually having fun. A game had begun, and she was suddenly very eager to see how it would be played. River, for his part, felt a sense of relief he hadn't experienced in years. This woman, Nora, was incredible. She was witty, she was sharp, and she hadn't asked him what he did for a living in that tone, the one that was really asking, "How much do you make?" She teased him, she challenged him, but she was looking at him, not at a walking bank account. He was so used to women's eyes glazing over with dollar signs the moment they learned his last name. But Nora? Her eyes were sparkling with genuine amusement. He was falling, and falling hard. He had started this whole secret billionaire experiment as a cynical defense mechanism, a way to filter out the gold diggers. He had been on 5 disastrous dates, posing as a carpenter, a librarian, and even an aspiring street magician. He'd been ghosted, laughed at, and had a drink thrown in his face. But Nora was different. She was real. And he found himself desperately wanting this to work. "So," he said as the waiter brought their check, "despite my questionable plumbing knowledge, would you be willing to see me again?" Nora pretended to think for a moment, tapping her chin. "I don't know, River. My pipes have been making a funny noise lately. I might need a second opinion." He grinned, a real, unguarded grin that made her stomach do a little flip. "I'd be happy to take a look. My diagnostic skills are top-notch." "I'll bet they are," she said, her smile matching his. Okay, plumber, you've got yourself a second date. As they walked out of the restaurant, he insisted on walking her to the subway. At the station entrance, they paused under the streetlights. I had a really good time tonight, Nora, he said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. Me too, River, she replied, and she meant it. It was educational. He laughed. Good night, Nora. Good night, plumber. She watched him walk away, a confident stride that was completely at odds with his flimsy cover story. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to Jessica. The plumber was a disaster. His hands are softer than a baby's. He thinks tubular is a plumbing term, and he wears a watch that's probably worth more than my apartment. But he's funny and charming, and I think I'm going to see him again. Jessica's reply was instantaneous. Wait, what? An expensive watch? Maybe he's a high-end plumber, like for celebrities. Nora laughed as she typed back. Yeah, Jess. Or maybe he's something else entirely. She put her phone away, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. Okay, Mr. River the Plumber Grant, she whispered to the empty street. Let's see how deep this rabbit hole really goes. The game was on, and Nora Wright had every intention of winning. The next morning, River Grant stood in his penthouse apartment, which was less of an apartment and more of a glass and marble kingdom floating 50 stories above the city. He was sipping a ridiculously expensive espresso and staring at a financial report that detailed a hostile takeover he was planning, but his mind wasn't on the multi-billion-dollar deal. It was on Nora Wright. A plumber, he muttered to himself, a slow smile spreading across his face. She thinks I'm a plumber. Sir? His assistant, Arthur, a man who looked like he was born wearing a perfectly pressed suit, appeared at his side holding a tablet. The preliminary numbers for the German acquisition are in. We're looking at a 17% market share increase if we close this week. Cancel my 2 o'clock, River said, still staring out the window, a thoughtful look on his face. Arthur blinked, his programming momentarily glitching. Cancelled the meeting with the board of Sterling Bank, sir? But that's a $100 million credit line. I have a complicated pipe situation to attend to, River replied, completely serious. Reschedule it. Arthur just stared, his mind trying and failing to compute this new variable. Pipes. His boss, a man who once fired a junior executive for using the wrong font in a presentation, was canceling a 9-figure deal for pipes. Very good, sir, he finally managed, making a note on his tablet that probably read, investigate local plumbing emergencies and/or schedule a psychological evaluation for Mr. Grant. River's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, but he knew exactly who it was. Hey, plumber. It's Nora. My sink is making a gurgling noise. Sounds serious. I might need that second opinion sooner than I thought. You free this afternoon to help a damsel in plumbing distress? He grinned, typing back immediately. Your trusty plumber is at your service. Send me the address. I'll bring my tools. He didn't have any tools. He didn't even know what tools a plumber used. But he was more excited than he had been for any business deal in years. 2 hours later, River was standing in front of a hardware store in Brooklyn, wearing another brand-new, carefully selected normal guy outfit. He had spent a solid 45 minutes on Google watching Plumbing for Dummies videos, and now felt vaguely confident he could at least identify a wrench. Ready for this? Nora asked, appearing at his side with a mischievous sparkle in her eyes. She was wearing overalls with a smear of paint on the knee, and he thought she had never looked more beautiful. Born ready, he lied, trying to look like he belonged in a place that smelled of sawdust and fertilizer. Great, she said, grabbing a shopping cart. Because I need to replace the entire siphon system under my sink, and maybe install a new shelf in the living room. You're good with shelves, right? Shelves are just horizontal pipes, he said. A statement so nonsensical that Nora had to turn away for a second to hide her laugh. They walked into the vast, overwhelming world of the hardware store. Nora, who had spent years restoring old furniture, moved through the aisles with the confidence of a general. River followed, trying to look knowledgeable and nodding seriously at things he didn't understand. Okay, let's start with the basics, she said, stopping in the plumbing aisle. I need a good pipe wrench. She gestured to a wall covered in an intimidating array of metal tools. Which one do you recommend? River stared at the wall of wrenches. There were big ones, small ones, ones with weird claws, ones that looked like medieval torture devices. His mind went blank. The YouTube video had shown a picture for 2 seconds, but they all looked the same now. "Well?" he began, stalling for time as he pointed vaguely at a large, menacing-looking one. "That one, the big grabby twisty thing. It's very robust." Nora picked it up, testing its weight. "The grabby twisty thing?" she repeated, her voice perfectly deadpan. "Is that the technical term?" "Among us professionals, yes," he confirmed, praying she wouldn't ask any follow-up questions. She didn't. She just smiled that little secret smile of hers and put the wrench in the cart. "Good to know. Now, for the siphon. I was thinking of getting a standard P-trap, but I saw they have these new flexible models. What's your take? Better flow?" River's mind was a frantic scramble of half-remembered diagrams. Flow. He'd said something about flow on their first date. "Absolutely," he said with unearned confidence. "Flow is crucial. You want maximum fluidity. The flexible ones are definitely more fluid." "Fluid," she repeated, nodding seriously as she put a flexible pipe in the cart. "Makes sense." She was toying with him, and he knew it, and the most infuriating part was that he was loving every second of it. He was so caught up in the game that he almost gave himself away in the next aisle. While Nora was looking at different types of wood screws, River's eyes were drawn to a display of high-end power drills. He walked over, picking one up instinctively. "Wow, look at the torque on this new Makita," he said, admiring the tool. "The brushless motor is a game-changer for battery efficiency, and the ergonomic grip is perfectly balanced." He stopped, realizing what he'd just said. He looked up and saw Nora staring at him, one eyebrow raised. "Brushless motors? Ergonomic grips?" she asked, her voice laced with amusement. "That's pretty advanced knowledge for a guy who calls a wrench a grabby twisty thing." He quickly put the drill down, his face flushing. I watch a lot of home improvement shows," he stammered. "You know, for professional development." "Of course," she said, her smile widening. "Professional development." They finished their shopping, with River narrowly avoiding several other verbal traps involving sandpaper grits and the structural integrity of drywall anchors. By the time they got to the checkout, he felt like he'd just survived a 3-hour deposition. As they walked to her apartment, carrying the bags of supplies, Nora was in high spirits. "You know, for a professional, you're surprisingly open to new ideas," she said. "Most plumbers I know are very set in their ways about PVC versus copper." "I'm a modern plumber," he said, proud of his quick thinking. "I embrace innovation." Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a charming brownstone. The moment he stepped inside, he was captivated. It was a reflection of her. Warm, creative, and full of personality. The walls were covered in a mix of art prints and her own sketches. The furniture was a collection of restored vintage pieces, each one clearly brought back to life by her own hands. "This is your place?" he asked, looking around with genuine admiration. "It's incredible." "Thanks," she said, dropping the bags on the floor. "Most of it was trash before I got my hands on it." "You have a real gift, Nora," he said, running his hand over a beautifully refinished wooden coffee table. "The way you see the potential in things, it's a rare talent." She looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, the game was gone. There was no plumber, no billionaire, just 2 people standing in a sun-drenched living room, sharing a moment of real connection. "Okay, plumber," she said, breaking the spell as she clapped her hands together. "Time to get to work. That sink isn't going to fix itself." What followed was a comedy of errors. River, under Nora's playfully dictatorial supervision, attempted to tackle the plumbing under her kitchen sink. He managed to get more water on the floor than in the bucket, dropped the grabby, twisty thing on his foot, and at one point got his head stuck between 2 pipes. "Are you sure you've done this before?" Nora asked, laughing so hard she had to lean against the counter for support as she watched him struggle. "It's a very unique pipe configuration," he grunted, trying to wiggle his head free. "Very non-standard." She finally took pity on him, read the instructions, and guided him through the process. An hour later, the new siphon was installed. It leaked, but only a little. "See?" he said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of dirt on his forehead. "Teamwork." "Right," she said, placing a bucket under the small drip. "You provided the moral support." Next came the shelf. This, River thought, would be easier. It was just a piece of wood and 2 brackets. He was wrong. He managed to hang the shelf completely crooked, drilled a hole in the wrong place, and almost dropped the entire thing on her prized collection of ceramic birds. Okay, I surrender, he said, laughing as he put the drill down. I am officially the world's worst handyman. You're not the worst, she said, taking the drill from him with a smile. But you are definitely in the bottom 5. She fixed the shelf in under 10 minutes, her movements quick and efficient. He just stood back and watched, completely mesmerized. They ended up sitting on the floor of her living room, surrounded by tools and sawdust, sharing a pizza she'd ordered. So, she said, taking a bite, I'm guessing plumber is not your main gig. His heart stopped. Had she figured it out completely? What makes you say that? He asked, trying to sound casual. Let's see, she said, ticking off points on her fingers. Your hands are softer than a CEO's. You know more about brushless motors than pipe fittings, and you hang a shelf with the structural integrity of a wet napkin. She took another bite of pizza. But you did manage to not get sauce on your shirt this time, so that's progress. He laughed, a sound of pure relief. She was still playing the game. I'm a man of many hidden talents, he said. Hidden is the key word. She retorted, a playful glint in her eye. They ate in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. You know, Nora, he said, his voice quieter now. Today was fun. More fun than I've had in a long time. Even with your near-death experience under my sink? Especially with that, he said, and he meant it. He looked around her apartment again, at the world she had built with her own hands, at the woman sitting across from him who was so unapologetically herself. I know I'm not who you think I am, he began, the lie suddenly feeling heavy and wrong. She stopped eating and looked at him, her expression unreadable. And who do you think I think you are, River? He didn't know how to answer that. He was a liar, a billionaire playing a part. But in that moment, sitting on her floor, covered in sawdust, he had never felt more like himself. I think, he said slowly, looking her straight in the eye, that I'm just a man who is incredibly lucky to have met you. Nora held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not suspicion, not amusement, but something warmer, something that made his heart beat a little faster. Well, plumber, she said, a small genuine smile gracing her lips. For a liar, you're surprisingly honest. The day after the hardware store adventure, Nora's tiny apartment was in a state of controlled chaos. Tools were scattered on the floor, the new shelf was proudly and perfectly mounted on the wall, and the kitchen sink was, miraculously, no longer leaking. Her phone buzzed with a text from River. Survived the night. No mysterious floods or falling shelves. I'd call that a success. Hope you're patient. The sink is recovering well. Nora smiled, typing back. The patient is stable, no thanks to the surgeon, but the moral support was top-notch. I've decided to forgive your complete lack of handyman skills. His reply was instantaneous. To celebrate my forgiveness, how about a less practical date? There's a new photography exhibit at the Met. I hear it's very picturesque. Nora laughed. A plumber who suggests the Met? This man was a walking contradiction, and she was finding it utterly irresistible. The Met? Are you sure you won't get sawdust on the Picassos? I'll wear my fanciest non-sawdust-covered jeans. Saturday, 2 p.m. I'll meet you there. Nora confirmed, a playful smile on her face. A date at the Met with a man pretending to be a plumber. The game was getting more interesting by the minute. On Saturday, Nora arrived at the museum to find River already waiting by the entrance. He was wearing dark jeans and a simple, well-fitted gray sweater. He looked devastatingly handsome, and once again, nothing like a plumber. You clean up nice, plumber, she teased as she approached. I left my grabby, twisty thing at home, he replied with a grin, falling effortlessly back into their shared joke. Thought it might not be appropriate for the museum. They walked into the exhibit, a vast, quiet space filled with stunning black and white photographs of cityscapes. Nora, a visual artist herself, was immediately in her element, pointing out details in composition and lighting. River walked beside her, listening intently, but Nora noticed something odd. He wasn't just agreeing with her, he was adding his own. Surprisingly insightful comments. Look at the use of negative space here, Nora said, pointing to a stark photo of a lone figure on a bridge. It creates such a sense of isolation. It's very Hopper-esque, River commented almost to himself. The geometry of the architecture boxes the subject in. It's not just isolation, it's a chosen solitude. Nora stopped and turned to him, one eyebrow raised. Hopper-esque? That's a pretty artsy term for a plumber. He froze for a second, a flicker of panic in his eyes before he quickly recovered. I watch a lot of documentaries on PBS, he said, a little too quickly. You know, about art and pipes. Sometimes they overlap. Art and pipes, she repeated, her face a perfect mask of seriousness. Of course, the great plumbing artists of the Renaissance. He laughed, a nervous but genuine sound. Exactly. Michelangelo was famously good with a drain snake. She let it slide but filed the information away. PBS documentaries. Right. They continued through the gallery, the game of cat and mouse in full swing. He'd make a sophisticated observation about photographic techniques, then quickly try to relate it back to plumbing in the most absurd way possible. The grain in this photo gives it such a raw texture, a tangible quality, he'd say, and then add, almost like the feel of a high-quality copper pipe before you solder it. Nora would just nod sagely, as if this were the most profound insight she had ever heard. It was in front of a large, haunting photograph of an empty city street at dawn that the mood shifted. The photo was beautiful, but achingly lonely. Nora was about to make a comment about the composition when she noticed that River had gone completely silent. He was staring at the image, but his gaze was distant, his charming smile gone, replaced by an expression of profound sadness. "River?" she asked softly. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He didn't look at her, his eyes still fixed on the photograph. "No," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Just a reflection." He took a deep breath. "Do you ever feel like people don't see you? I mean, the real you?" The question was so unexpected, so raw, that it caught Nora completely off guard. The playful plumber was gone. In his place was a man revealing a genuine crack in his armor. "Sometimes," she answered honestly. He finally turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was startling. "I grew up in a family where the family business was everything," he said, carefully choosing his words. "It's a big business, successful, and from the time I was a kid that's all anyone ever saw. Not me, River, but the heir to the business, the future of the company." Nora listened, her heart suddenly aching for him. He was still lying about the details, but she knew, with a certainty that was almost physical, that the emotions were real. Every conversation, every relationship, it was always in the background, he continued, his voice quiet and tinged with a bitterness she'd never heard before. "Do they like me, or do they like what the business can do for them? Do they want to be my friend, or do they want a contract? After a while, you stop being able to tell the difference." He looked away, back at the lonely street in the photograph. "So I started this experiment to see if it was possible to meet someone who could just see me. A normal guy, without the company, without the name, without the pipes." He gave a small, sad smile. In that moment, Nora's perspective shifted entirely. This wasn't just a game for him. It wasn't a billionaire slumming it for fun. It was a desperate, clumsy, and deeply human attempt to find something real. He wasn't playing a trick on her. He was trying to protect himself. "And?" she asked softly. "Did the experiment work?" He finally looked at her, and his eyes were so full of a raw, hopeful emotion that it made her breath catch. "I met you," he said simply, as if that were the only answer that mattered. The intimacy of the moment was so intense it felt like they were the only two people in the museum. The playful banter, the witty comebacks, the entire game of cat and mouse, it all melted away, leaving behind something fragile and incredibly real. "River," she started, not even knowing what she was going to say. "River? River Grant, is that you, darling?" A loud, theatrical voice shattered the moment. A woman in her late 60s, draped in what looked like an entire jewelry store and a fur coat despite the mild weather, was bearing down on them like a luxury cruise ship. River's face went from vulnerable to sheer panic in a millisecond. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath. He grabbed Nora's hand. "Quick, I just remembered a very important faucet exhibit in the modern sculpture wing." He started pulling her away, but it was too late. "River, it is you," the woman exclaimed, blocking their path. "I almost didn't recognize you in those rustic clothes. Are you doing some sort of charity event?" Mrs. DeWitt, River said, forcing a tight, panicked smile. What a surprise. And who is this lovely young thing? Mrs. DeWitt asked, giving Nora a once-over that was a masterclass in polite condescension. This is Nora, River said quickly. She's a colleague, a plumbing consultant. A plumbing consultant? Mrs. DeWitt repeated the words as if they were from a foreign and rather dirty language. How fascinating. Well, you must both come to my gala on Saturday. Everyone will be there. We'd love to, but we're incredibly busy with a massive citywide pipe crisis, River said, pulling Nora behind him. It's been lovely seeing you, Mrs. DeWitt. He practically sprinted away, dragging a very confused Nora with him, weaving through the crowd until they were safely hidden behind a large, abstract metal sculpture that looked like a pile of, well, pipes. Okay, Nora said, catching her breath and trying not to laugh. Who was that? And what was that about a citywide pipe crisis? That, River said, peeking around the sculpture, was the most dangerous gossip columnist in New York City. And the pipe crisis is what we call an emergency exit strategy. She finally let out the laugh she'd been holding in. You are the most ridiculous man I have ever met. Thank you, he said, grinning, the panic in his eyes replaced by amusement. I do my best. They left the museum, the easy, playful energy between them restored, but now it was layered with something new, something deeper. They walked through Central Park as the afternoon sun cast a golden light through the trees. So, she said, her tone gentle, the family business, it's a heavy weight to carry. You have no idea, he said, his smile fading slightly. Sometimes it feels like I'm just playing a part that was written for me before I was even born. Maybe it's time to write your own script, she suggested softly. He stopped walking and turned to her. I think, he said, his voice full of a sincerity that made her heart ache, that's what I'm trying to do with you. They stood there in the quiet of the park, the city noise a distant hum. He reached out, not to grab her hand in a rush, but to gently cup her cheek, his thumb softly tracing her jawline. Nora, he whispered, his eyes searching hers. She didn't pull away. She didn't make a joke. She just looked at him, at the lonely man behind the billionaire, at the scared boy behind the charming plumber. He leaned in, and this time, the kiss was different. It wasn't a clumsy, surprising clash in a moment of panic. It was slow and tender, and full of all the unspoken things that had just passed between them. It was a kiss that tasted of vulnerability and a fragile, hopeful new beginning. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. I'm sorry for lying to you, he murmured. You haven't told me the whole truth yet. She whispered back. I know, he said, and that terrifies me. She pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. You know, she said, a small knowing smile on her lips. For a man who's afraid, you're surprisingly brave. He laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. As they started walking again, their hands naturally found each other. The game wasn't over, but it had changed. It was no longer about who was fooling whom. It was about how long two people could hold on to a beautiful, complicated lie before the truth changed everything. A week after the museum trip, River found himself in what he internally called his plumber pad. A small, tastefully minimalist but decidedly non-billionaire apartment he had rented in Brooklyn for the sole purpose of maintaining his cover. He was staring at a box of spaghetti with the same intensity he usually reserved for hostile merger documents. Okay, he said to his empty kitchen. Boil water, add pasta, wait 8 to 10 minutes. How hard can it be? He was about to find out. He was attempting to cook for Nora for the first time, a gesture he hoped would scream normal, capable boyfriend, and not man who usually has a personal chef. By the time Nora arrived, the kitchen was a war zone. The smoke alarm was chirping a sad, defeated little beep. A pot of water had boiled over onto the stove, and River was holding a colander full of spaghetti that had somehow managed to both stick together in a single, solid brick and be undercooked at the same time. Nora stopped at the kitchen entrance, took in the scene, and burst out laughing. Wow, plumber, it looks like you tried to fix a leak and it exploded. The instructions were deceptive, he said, defending his culinary honor as he poked the spaghetti brick with a fork. They said al dente. This is more like al concrete. She walked over, still laughing, and gently took the colander from him. Let me guess, you dumped all the pasta in at once without stirring, didn't you? Is that not the correct procedure? Only if you're trying to build a pasta sculpture, she said, her eyes twinkling. She peered into the pot on the stove, where a red sauce was bubbling ominously. And what is this masterpiece? That, he said with a hint of pride, is my grandmother's secret marinara sauce. Nora dipped a spoon in, tasted it, and her expression was a perfect blend of sympathy and amusement. River, did your grandmother's recipe by any chance include an entire jar of sugar? He blinked. Is that too much? Only if you're not planning on serving it over ice cream, she said, patting his arm. Don't worry, I can fix this. For the next hour, they worked side by side in the small kitchen. Nora, with the effortless grace of someone who actually knew how to cook, salvaged the sauce, taught him how to properly boil pasta, and even managed to make a garlic bread that didn't set off the smoke alarm. River was relegated to the role of official vegetable chopper, a job he performed with intense, almost surgical concentration. You know, he said, meticulously dicing a tomato, this is surprisingly fun. What? Ruining a perfectly good meal? No, he said, looking at her as she stirred the sauce, her face illuminated by the warm light of the kitchen. Doing this with you. She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made his heart do that stupid little flip again. They ate at his small kitchen table, the salvaged spaghetti tasting better than any Michelin star meal he'd ever had. The conversation was easy, flowing from her work to his increasingly absurd, made-up stories about his plumbing adventures. Nora, playing her part, had started leaving little tests for him. You know, River, I have this freelance client, a real nightmare, she began casually, swirling pasta on her fork. He's trying to get out of paying me for a big branding project I just finished. Oh yeah? River said, his CEO instincts immediately kicking in, though he tried to hide it. What's his excuse? He's claiming the work isn't what he envisioned, even though he approved every single draft, she said, a note of real frustration in her voice. He's a slippery guy. Keeps quoting obscure clauses from our contract. Let me see the contract, River said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly from charming plumber to ruthless businessman. What would you know about contracts? She teased, but she pulled her laptop out anyway, eager to see how he would handle this. She opened the email chain with her client, a man named Mr. Sterling. River pulled his chair closer, his arm brushing against hers as he leaned in to read the screen. The playful energy between them vanished, replaced by a focused intensity. As he read, Nora watched his expression change. His brow furrowed, his jaw tightened, and his eyes, which were usually warm and amused when he was with her, turned sharp and cold as steel. This guy's an amateur, River muttered, scrolling through the emails. He's using standard delay tactics, trying to drown you in vague complaints to force a discount. He pointed to a line in the contract. See this? The subjective satisfaction clause. It's an old trick, but it's legally weak if you have a documented approval trail. Nora stared at him. He wasn't just offering friendly advice. He was dissecting the situation with the precision of a corporate lawyer. He approved the final mock-ups via email last Tuesday, she said, her character's frustration now mixed with her own real fascination. Perfect, River said, his voice now crisp and authoritative. That's all we need. Okay, here's what you're going to do. Draft an email. Subject line, final invoice and documentation for project approval. Nora started typing as he dictated, her fingers flying to keep up. Dear Mr. Sterling, River began, his voice calm and lethal. Pursuant to our signed agreement, I am reissuing the final invoice for the completed branding project. For your convenience, I have attached the full email correspondence in which you provided written approval at each stage of development, including the final design on Tuesday, October 24th. As per Section 4B of our contract, final approval constitutes acceptance of work and triggers the 15-day payment term. We look forward to receiving settlement in a timely manner to avoid the late fees stipulated in Section 6C. He stopped, took a breath, and then delivered the killing blow. Should you wish to contest this further, I am, of course, happy to forward all documentation to my legal counsel. Best regards, Nora Wright. Nora's hands froze over the keyboard. She slowly turned to look at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and suspicion. The charming, clumsy plumber had just dictated an email that was a work of corporate warfare art. Legal counsel? She repeated slowly. That's A bit aggressive for a plumber's advice, don't you think? River blinked, snapping out of his CEO trance. He looked at the email on the screen, then at Nora's stunned face, and realized he'd just massively overplayed his hand. I watch a lot of legal dramas, he said, scrambling for an excuse. You know, Suits, The Good Wife, you pick things up. You picked up Pursuant and Stipulated from a TV show? She asked, one eyebrow arched so high it was practically in her hairline. They're very educational shows, he insisted, though he knew he sounded ridiculous. Great for learning about legal pipes. Legal pipes, she repeated, her face a perfect blank slate. Of course. She didn't press him further. She just looked at the email, then back at him, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. Okay, plumber, let's see if your TV law degree works. She hit send. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound being the hum of the refrigerator. River was sweating. What if the guy called his bluff? What if he'd just made everything worse for her? Then Nora's laptop pinged, a new email, from Mr. Sterling. She opened it. It was short and not so sweet. My sincerest apologies, Miss Wright. There seems to have been a misunderstanding on my part. The invoice will be paid in full by the end of the day. My compliments on your excellent and very thorough work. Nora read the email out loud, her voice laced with triumph. She then turned her chair to face River, who was looking at her with a mixture of pride and sheer panic. She leaned forward, her eyes sparkling. River, she said, her voice a low, playful purr. For a guy who fixes toilets, you know an awful lot about how to make a corporate shark back down. He laughed, a nervous, shaky sound. Like I said, it's all about understanding the flow. Right, she said, her smile never wavering. The flow. She leaned in a little closer, and the playful energy between them suddenly turned electric. You know, all this talk about contracts and legal counsel, it's surprisingly attractive. Is it? He whispered, his own voice suddenly rough. Definitely, she murmured. She closed the laptop, effectively shutting down the last barrier between them. She stood up and walked around the small table, stopping right in front of him. Thank you for helping me, River. You were amazing. Anytime, he said, his eyes fixed on her lips. She gently touched the smudge of dirt that was still on his forehead from his earlier attempt at plumbing. You know, she whispered, her fingers tracing a line down his cheek. You're a terrible plumber. And a pretty convincing liar. She paused, her lips just a breath from his. But you're a really, really good partner. And with that, she closed the distance, kissing him with a fierceness and gratitude that took his breath away. The lie was still there, hanging between them, bigger and more obvious than ever. But as he kissed her back, pulling her onto his lap, River realized he didn't care. Because for the first time, he hadn't used his money or his power to fix a problem. He had used his mind, his true self, and she was kissing him for it. A week after River's impromptu legal consultation, Nora found a thick, cream-colored envelope in her mailbox. Inside were 2 tickets to the annual Metropolitan Museum of Art's Conservation Gala, one of the most exclusive and expensive charity events in New York City. A small, typed note was attached. Ms. Wright, in gratitude for your exceptional work and your thoroughness, T. Sterling. Nora stared at the tickets, a slow, wicked smile spreading across her face. Mr. Sterling, the client River had so expertly terrified into paying his bill, had just handed her the perfect weapon. Or rather, the perfect laboratory for her ongoing experiment. What better place to test a fake plumber than in the heart of the city's high society? She pulled out her phone and texted River. Hey, plumber, you won't believe what just happened. My difficult client was so happy with my work and my very persuasive legal threats that he sent me 2 tickets to the Met Gala this Friday as a thank you. Do plumbers go to galas? His reply came almost instantly. Galas? I don't know. I think they usually clash with our pipe-fixing schedules. But for you, I'll make an exception. What's the dress code? Fancy overalls? Nora laughed. Tuxedo, River, and don't worry, I'll teach you which fork to use. It's a date. On Friday night, Arthur, River's assistant, was in a state of quiet panic. He was standing in River's walk-in closet, which was the size of a small apartment, surrounded by at least 30 tuxedos. Sir, are you absolutely certain about this one? Arthur asked, holding up a perfectly tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. It's exquisite, but it's also from the latest collection. What if someone recognizes it? Arthur, River said, adjusting the cuffs of a crisp white shirt. "The goal is to look like a plumber who is trying to look good, not like a billionaire. Find me something less perfect." "Less perfect, sir?" Arthur repeated, the concept utterly foreign to him. "Yes. Something from the back. Something I wore 2 years ago. And for God's sake, not the Patek Philippe. Give me the old Omega my grandfather left me. The one with the leather strap." "The vintage Omega, sir?" Arthur looked horrified. "But that's sentimental." "Exactly," River said with a grin. "It's my plumber who inherited a watch from his grandpa watch." When River arrived at Nora's brownstone, he looked just right. He was handsome enough to turn heads, but his slightly out-of-season tuxedo and understated watch gave him an air of someone who was trying, but didn't quite belong. "Perfect." Nora opened the door, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. She was wearing a simple, elegant emerald green dress that hugged her curves and made her eyes sparkle. She looked like a goddess. "Wow," he said, his voice a little rough. "You look, wow. You don't look so bad yourself, plumber," she said with a warm smile. "Ready to swim with the sharks?" "As long as I'm with you," he replied, and he meant it more than she could possibly know. The gala was a glittering, overwhelming spectacle of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, a string quartet played softly in the corner, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet ambition. Nora, who had never been to an event this opulent, felt a genuine flutter of nerves. River, on the other hand, had to actively suppress his instinct to navigate the room with the casual authority of a king in his own court. "Okay," Nora whispered, linking her arm through his as they stepped into the main hall. "Rule number 1 of high society: look impressed, but not too impressed. Like you've seen it all before, but you're still enjoying the view." "Got it," River said, putting on a face of mild, pleasant surprise as he looked at a Degas sculpture that his family's foundation had loaned to the museum. "Wow, look at that statue. It's very statuesque." Nora squeezed his arm, trying not to laugh. "You're a natural." They mingled, with Nora acting as his guide. She pointed out famous artists and old-money socialites, whispering little backstories she'd read in magazines. River, meanwhile, was playing the part of the fascinated outsider, asking questions he already knew the answers to and making plumbing-related observations about the museum's architecture. "You know," he said, looking up at the grand vaulted ceiling, "the water pressure in a building this old must be a nightmare. I'd love to see their pipe schematics." "Let's try to keep the shop talk to a minimum tonight, okay?" she said, patting his arm. It was near the champagne fountain that their game was almost upended. A man with silver hair and a sharp, predatory smile approached them. It was Julian Thorne, River's biggest rival in the hotel industry. "Grant," Julian said, his eyes lighting up with malicious glee as he looked River up and down. "Fancy seeing you here, and dressed so modestly. Are you in between takeovers?" River's smile never wavered, but Nora felt his arm tense under her hand. "Thorne," he said, his voice dangerously smooth, "always a pleasure." Julian's gaze shifted to Nora, his smile widening. "And you haven't introduced me to your lovely companion." Before River could invent another lie, Nora stepped forward, extending her hand with a confidence that surprised even herself. "Nora Wright," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm River's cultural attaché." Both men blinked. "Cultural attaché?" Julian repeated, intrigued. "Yes," Nora continued, her mind racing. "River's plumbing business is looking to expand into the luxury hotel market, and he's hired me to help him understand the aesthetic and social nuances of the high-end hospitality world." She gestured vaguely at the opulent room. "Tonight is part of his field research." River almost choked on his champagne. It was the most brilliant, absurd, and perfect lie he had ever heard. Julian looked from Nora to River, who was now nodding with intense seriousness. "Plumbing for luxury hotels," Julian said slowly, a look of utter confusion on his face. "How innovative." "We believe there's a real gap in the market for artisanal, bespoke plumbing solutions," River added, getting into the spirit of it. "We're talking handcrafted faucets, pipes aligned with feng shui principles. It's the next big thing." Julian stared at them for a long, silent moment, then finally shook his head. "Well, Grant, you've always been unpredictable." "A pleasure, Miss Nat Wright." He walked away, clearly convinced he just had a conversation with two lunatics. As soon as he was out of earshot, River pulled Nora into a secluded alcove behind a marble column. He was laughing, a real, deep, joyful laugh that made her heart melt. "Cultural attaché?" he said, wiping a tear from his eye. "Feng shui pipes? You're a genius." "I'm a quick thinker," she said, her own face flushed with the adrenaline of their shared deception. "And you owe me. Big time." "I owe you my life," he said, his laughter subsiding, his expression turning serious. He looked down at her, the playful energy between them shifting into something more intense. "Thank you for that, Nora." "We're a team, right?" she said, her voice a little breathless. "Yeah," he said, his gaze dropping to her lips. "We are." The music from the string quartet swelled, and he held out a hand. "May I have this dance, my brilliant cultural attaché?" She smiled and took his hand. "You may, my innovative plumber." He led her to the dance floor, and as he pulled her into his arms, the rest of the world faded away. They moved together perfectly, a silent conversation passing between them. The game was still on, but it was no longer about deception. It was about partnership. "I hate lying to you," he murmured into her hair as they swayed to the music. "I know," she whispered back, "but you're getting surprisingly good at it." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. "Nora," he said, his voice full of a sincerity that transcended all the lies. "Tonight, being here with you, it's the first time in years I've actually enjoyed one of these things. Even with the threat of your arch-nemesis, especially with that," he said, "because I wasn't alone." In that moment, under the glittering chandeliers surrounded by the city's elite, Nora realized her little experiment had gone horribly, beautifully wrong. She hadn't just trapped a billionaire in a lie. She had started to fall in love with the man underneath it. When they left the gala, they didn't take the waiting town car. Instead, they walked, the cool night air a welcome relief after the stuffy ballroom. The sound of her heels and his dress shoes echoed on the empty sidewalk. "So," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Was your field research a success?" He laughed, taking her hand. "It was eye-opening. I learned that champagne tastes better when you're pretending not to be able to afford it." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder as they walked. They ended up at a small, all-night diner, a brightly lit beacon of normalcy, after the opulence of the gala. They slid into a booth, the worn vinyl a stark contrast to the velvet chairs they'd been sitting on an hour before. They ordered coffee and a shared slice of apple pie. "This is more my speed," she said, taking a sip of the diner coffee. "Mine too," he said, and she knew he wasn't lying. They sat there for a long time, just talking. The facades were gone. There was no need for games or cover stories. He told her about the suffocating pressure of his world, the constant expectation, the loneliness. She told him about her own struggles, the quiet fear of never being able to make her dreams a reality. "You know, for a man who's pretending to be someone else," she said, her voice soft, "you're the most real person I've met in a long time." He looked at her across the table, his eyes full of a raw, unguarded emotion. "That's because I'm only real when I'm with you, Nora." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I'm falling in love with you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And it terrifies me, because it's all built on a lie." She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. "Maybe," she said, her own voice thick with emotion, "the lie is just the story we had to tell to find the truth." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes, and in the quiet of the late-night diner, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the gentle hum of the city, River Grant, the billionaire, and Nora Wright, the graphic designer, finally stopped playing their game. He leaned across the table, and she met him halfway, sealing their new, fragile truth with a kiss that was as sweet and as real as the apple pie they had left forgotten on the plate between them. The week following the gala was a dizzying, wonderful blur. For the first time in his adult life, River Grant was acting like a man in love, not a CEO managing an asset. He'd show up at Nora's apartment with a bag of groceries and a hopeful expression, ready for another disastrous but hilarious cooking lesson. He learned that adding sugar to tomato sauce was a cardinal sin, that assembling IKEA furniture was a two-person job requiring at least one bottle of wine, and that listening to Nora talk passionately about the difference between mid-century modern and Art Deco was more fascinating than any stock market report. Nora, for her part, was leaning into the delightful absurdity of her new relationship. She was dating a man who was pretending to be a plumber, and she was pretending not to know he was lying. Their entire relationship was a playful, unspoken game, but the feelings blossoming within it were startlingly real. "Okay, plumber," she said one evening, as they were sitting on her newly and correctly installed shelf, which had become their favorite spot. "I need to ask you a serious question about your trade." "Ask away," he said, looking far too comfortable for a man who had almost drilled through his own hand an hour earlier. "When you're fixing a complicated pipe situation," she began, her eyes dancing with mischief, "do you ever feel the need to consult with international financial advisors first?" He choked on his beer. "That's a very specific question. Is this a trick?" "Just curious," she said with a shrug. "I'd imagine that aligning the pipes with global market trends could be very important for the fluidity." He burst out laughing, pulling her closer. "You are never going to let me live that down, are you?" "Never," she confirmed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Your plumbing-related lies are my favorite thing about you." He smiled, but a shadow of his old fear flickered in his eyes. He hated the lies. He hated the constant fear of being exposed. But he was even more terrified of what would happen when the truth finally came out. What if she looked at him differently? What if the easy, playful dynamic they had built was replaced by the same awkwardness and expectation he saw in everyone else's eyes? He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost missed what she said next. "Oh, by the way," she said, sitting up, "I got an email today. You're not going to believe it." "What is it?" "You know that design blog, Urban Aesthetics, the super famous one?" "I'm familiar with it," he said, his CEO brain automatically calculating its market reach and ad revenue. "Well, they want to do a feature on me," she said, a note of genuine disbelief in her voice. "About my furniture restoration, my design philosophy. They're calling it the new face of Brooklyn design." For a second, River's heart soared with pride. She deserved this. Her talent was immense, and the world was finally starting to notice. But then, a cold wave of panic washed over him. An interview. A feature article. That meant questions. Personal questions. "Nora, that's incredible," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know, it's insane, right?" she said, her face alight with an excitement that was both beautiful and terrifying to him. "They're sending a journalist and a photographer to my apartment on Friday. That was in 3 days. 3 days until a professional journalist whose job it was to dig into people's lives would be sitting in Nora's living room asking about her inspirations, her work, and inevitably, her new boyfriend." "That's fast," he managed to say. "Tell me about it," she said, already planning. "I need to clean the place up, maybe finish restoring that vintage armchair." She trailed off, noticing the look on his face. The joy on her own face slowly faded, replaced by a look of sharp, knowing concern. "River, what is it? You look like you've just seen a ghost." He tried to force a smile. "No, it's nothing. I'm just so happy for you." She didn't buy it. She moved closer, her playful demeanor gone, her gaze now serious and perceptive. "No, it's more than that. This interview, it's making you nervous, isn't it?" He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "It's your moment, Nora. I don't want to overshadow it." "Overshadow it," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Or get exposed by it." He finally looked at her, the panic and fear he'd been hiding now plain on his face. He didn't have to say anything. She already knew. "It's the boyfriend question, isn't it?" she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "The part where they ask about the down-to-earth plumber I'm dating." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure, frustrated anxiety. "Nora, I'm so sorry. I've put you in an impossible position. This is your big break, and my stupid secret is about to ruin it." She watched him, her expression a mix of sympathy and something that looked almost like affection for his panicked state. She had seen him handle a corporate rival with icy calm. She had heard him dictate a legal threat that could make a shark sweat. And now, he was falling apart over a magazine interview. She gently took his hand. "Hey," she said, her voice a soothing balm on his frayed nerves. "Look at me." He did, and he looked like a lost little boy. "First of all," she said, her voice taking on a tone of calm authority, "you are not going to ruin anything, and second, you seem to have forgotten who you're dealing with." She gave him a small, confident smile. I'm a woman who can turn trash into treasure, remember? Handling one curious journalist is nothing. But what will you say? He asked, his voice full of a vulnerability she'd never seen before. The moment they Google River the plumber, they'll find nothing. Then they'll start digging and that's why we're not going to let them dig, she said, her eyes sparkling with a familiar, mischievous light. She stood up and started pacing, her designer brain now fully engaged in a new kind of project, damage control. Okay, here's the plan. We're going to give them a story, but it's going to be our story, on our terms. He just stared at her, completely in awe. She wasn't angry, she wasn't disappointed, she was taking charge, she was protecting him. The interview is here in my apartment, she continued, thinking out loud. That's our home turf, I control the environment. She stopped and pointed at him. You'll be here. I will, he asked, horrified. Nora, that's a terrible idea. What if I say something stupid? What if I mention my family's extensive pipe collection? You'll be here as my handyman, she said, a brilliant, wicked smile spreading across her face. You'll be in the background, fixing that leaky faucet I've been meaning to look at. You'll be wearing your most convincing plumber outfit. You'll be seen but not heard, a charming blue-collar backdrop to my artistic genius. He stared at her, a slow smile of his own starting to form. The plan was absurd, risky, and completely insane. It was perfect. You're enjoying this, aren't you? He said, a note of admiration in his voice. Immensely, she confirmed. You lied to me for weeks, Chet. River. It's only fair I get to use your lie for my own creative purposes. She walked back over to him and sat down, her expression softening. We'll get through this, she said, her voice now sincere. Together. He took her hand, his heart filled with a feeling so overwhelming he could barely name it. It was a mix of love, gratitude, and a profound sense of relief. He had spent his whole life building walls to protect himself, and here was this incredible woman, not trying to tear them down, but offering to stand guard with him. Okay, boss, he said, squeezing her hand. What's my first task? First, she said, a playful glint returning to her eyes, we need to get you a real tool belt. The one you have in your plumber pad looks like you bought it at a costume shop. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that was free of fear for the first time in days. It was from a costume shop, he admitted. I knew it, she said, shaking her head. Honestly, plumber, you're lucky you have me. On Friday, Nora's apartment was a flurry of activity. The journalist, a sharp and impeccably dressed woman named Clara, arrived with a photographer in tow. They immediately began cooing over Nora's restored furniture and clever design solutions. This is fabulous, Nora, Clara said, running a hand over a vintage armchair Nora had reupholstered. Your style is so authentic. Thank you, Nora said, trying to keep her nerves in check as she offered them coffee. I just like giving old things a new story. As the interview began, River made his grand entrance from the bedroom, dressed in overalls and carrying a very new, very shiny tool belt. He gave Nora a quick, nervous glance. Oh, don't mind him, Nora said to Clara, waving a dismissive hand. That's just River. He's fixing a leak under my sink. It's been gurgling for weeks. You know how it is with old buildings. Clara gave River a polite, disinterested smile before turning her attention back to Nora. The photographer, however, seemed intrigued. He discreetly snapped a few photos of the handsome handyman in the background. The interview was going perfectly. Nora was charming, articulate, and passionate. She talked about her design process, her love for vintage finds, and her belief that a home should be a reflection of a person's soul. River in the background was putting on an Oscar-worthy performance. He knelt by the sink, looking at the pipes with a deeply serious expression, occasionally tapping one with a wrench in a way he hoped looked professional. Then came the question they had been dreading. So, Nora, Clara said, leaning in with a conspiratorial smile, your star is clearly on the rise. Our readers will want to know, is there a special someone in your life? I couldn't help but notice the way your handyman was looking at you. Nora's heart did a little jump, but she kept her cool, just as they had rehearsed. She let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. Oh, River, she said, glancing over at him with a look of fond exasperation. He's a work in progress. In the background, River pretended to be deeply engrossed in tightening a bolt that was already as tight as it could go. He's a great guy, Nora continued, her voice full of a carefully crafted ambiguity. Very dedicated to his work. We've been spending some time together. He's teaching me all about the importance of proper drainage. Clara laughed, clearly charmed by the down-to-earth answer. Well, he's certainly the most handsome plumber I've ever seen. Isn't he? Nora said with a sigh. It's a real problem. Hard to focus on a leaky faucet when your plumber looks like that. The interview wrapped up soon after. Clara and the photographer left, promising the feature would be in next month's issue. The moment the door closed, Nora and River collapsed onto the sofa in a fit of relieved laughter. Legal pipes, he said, pulling her into a hug. You're a genius, an absolute diabolical genius. I told you I could handle it, she said, laughing against his chest. You just needed to trust your cultural attaché. They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the adrenaline of their shared performance giving way to a deep, comfortable intimacy. I love you, Nora, right? He said, his voice a low, serious rumble against her ear. I love you too, you ridiculous fake plumber, she whispered back. He pulled back, his expression turning serious. I'm going to tell you, he said. Everything. Soon. I promise. I know, she said, her own smile fading slightly. But just for tonight, can we just be us, the designer and the plumber? He smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. Deal. He kissed her, a long, slow kiss that was a celebration of their victory. They had faced the world together and won. But as they stood in the quiet of her apartment, lost in their own perfect, fragile bubble, neither of them knew that the photographer had taken one last photo through the window. A picture of them kissing. A picture that, when paired with the headline, Brooklyn's new design star and her mystery man, was about to cause a citywide pipe crisis of a very different kind. The 2 weeks that followed were the happiest of Nora's life. She was living inside her own romantic comedy, complete with a charming, mysterious lead and a script full of witty banter. River, true to his word, made no attempt to shower her with gifts or overwhelm her with his wealth. Instead, he wooed her with small, perfect gestures. He'd show up at her apartment after she'd had a long day, with her favorite takeout and a silly movie. He'd listen for hours as she talked about her design projects, offering insights that were always surprisingly sharp and helpful. He was, for all intents and purposes, the perfect boyfriend. He just also happened to be a complete fabrication. But for Nora, who was in on the joke, that was part of the fun. Their shared lie was their own private world, a secret garden where they could be themselves, away from the expectations of his world and the cynicism of hers. You know, she told him one night as they were walking through Brooklyn Bridge Park, the glittering Manhattan skyline spread out before them. I'm starting to get worried. Worried about what? He asked, pulling her closer. I'm actually starting to like this plumber guy, she said, a playful smile on her lips. He's funny, he's a great listener, and he's terrible at fixing things, which I find oddly endearing. I'm afraid when the real River Grant shows up, I might be disappointed. He stopped walking and turned to her, his expression serious under the park lights. There is no real River Grant without you, Nora, he said, his voice full of a sincerity that made her heart ache. You're the only person who's ever seen me, the real me, even when I was lying. She smiled, a real, unguarded smile. Well, the real you still owes me a new siphon for my sink. The one you installed is dripping again. He laughed, the tension broken. My plumbing skills are a work in progress. The article in Urban Aesthetics came out on a Tuesday, and it was a triumph. The journalist had perfectly captured Nora's spirit, her passion for design, and her unique voice. The photos were stunning, making her small apartment look like a chic bohemian paradise. Nora's phone started buzzing with congratulations from friends, family, and old clients. Her freelance business exploded overnight. I told you your talent was undeniable, River said, reading the article over her shoulder in her apartment, a proud smile on his face. They called my restoration work a masterclass in modern nostalgia, she read, her eyes wide with disbelief. I think that's the fanciest thing anyone has ever said about me. It was perfect. Almost. On the third page of the spread, there was a small, candid photo the photographer had snapped during the interview. It was of River in the background, tool belt and all, looking at Nora with an expression of such open, unguarded adoration that it was impossible to miss. The caption read, "Right in her Brooklyn studio, with a little help from her mysterious and very handsome handyman, rumored to be her new boyfriend." "Oh my God," Nora groaned, covering her face. "They put you in the article." "And they called me handsome," River said, puffing out his chest. "I think I can live with that." "This is not funny. What if someone recognizes you?" "Nora, relax," he said, pulling her into a hug. "I'm a plumber in overalls covered in what looks like pipe grease. No one is going to recognize me." He was wrong. The article was a sensation, and the photo of the mystery handyman created its own little storm on social media. People were charmed by the down-to-earth romance. Brooklyn designer and hot handyman started trending. Nora was flooded with comments. "Forget the furniture. Tell us more about the plumber. This is the real-life rom-com we all need." For a few days, it was fun. Nora and River laughed at the comments, enjoying their 15 minutes of anonymous internet fame. The fun stopped on a Friday morning. Nora was at her favorite coffee shop when her phone started buzzing with a ferocity it never had before. It was Jessica. "Nora, have you seen it?" Jessica's voice was a high-pitched shriek of panic. "Seen what?" "Jess, calm down. The High Society Ledger, Mrs. DeWitt's blog. You need to look at it. Now." Nora's blood ran cold. Mrs. DeWitt, the gossip columnist from the museum. With trembling hands, Nora opened her browser and navigated to the blog. The headline was plastered across the top of the page in giant, mocking letters. "The Billionaire Plumber, River Grant's shocking new social experiment, fools Brooklyn's latest it girl." The article was brutal. It featured the photo from Urban Aesthetics side by side with a picture of River from the Met Gala. Mrs. DeWitt, with her signature venom, had connected the dots. She recounted the fascinating story of the plumbing consultant she'd met at the museum, and then with devastating precision, she tore their entire story to shreds. She painted River as a bored, manipulative billionaire playing games with a working-class girl for his own amusement. And she painted Nora as either a clueless fool who had been completely duped or a cunning social climber who had orchestrated the whole thing. The comments section was a war zone. Some defended Nora, some attacked River, but most were just reveling in the scandal. Nora's moment of professional triumph had been completely and utterly hijacked. She was no longer the new face of Brooklyn design. She was the billionaire's plumber girl. She sat there in the coffee shop, the world spinning around her. Her phone was a relentless barrage of notifications, texts from friends, emails from clients, some curious, some canceling their projects. The dream had become a nightmare. With a cold, numb fury she hadn't felt in years, she stood up and walked out of the coffee shop. She knew where she had to go. River was in his penthouse on a conference call about that German acquisition when Nora stormed in. She didn't knock. She just threw the door open, her face a mask of pale, furious betrayal. He took one look at her and knew. The game was over. "Arthur, I'll call you back," he said, ending the call without waiting for a reply. He stood up slowly. "Nora?" "Don't," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. She held up her phone, the headline from Mrs. DeWitt's blog glowing on the screen. "Just don't." He felt the ground fall away from under him. "I saw it," he said, his own voice a hoarse whisper. "Nora, I am so sorry. I was about to call my lawyers. We can sue her for defamation. We can—" "Sue her?" She let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "You think this is something you can fix by throwing money at it? You think a lawsuit is going to erase this?" She threw her phone onto his billion-dollar sofa. "This is not a business problem, River. This is my life. My life, which you have turned into a public joke." "I never wanted this to happen," he said, taking a step toward her. "But it did," she shot back, taking a step away. "It did because you couldn't just be honest. Not with me, not with the world. You had to have your little game, your little secret." "It wasn't a game, Nora. It was what? A defense mechanism?" she interrupted, her voice rising with a pain that was sharper than anger. "You know, I actually felt sorry for you, the poor little rich boy who was so afraid of being loved for his money. But you know what's worse than being loved for your money, River? Being used by someone who's afraid of their own life." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. "I never used you." "Didn't you?" she said, tears now streaming down her face. "You used my world as your little hideout. You used my life as your costume. And now that the costume party is over, I'm the one left covered in glitter and shame while you just go back to your castle." She pointed a trembling finger at the panoramic window overlooking the city. "My big break, River. The one thing I have worked my entire life for. That article was supposed to be about my talent, my art. And now it's about you. It's all about the billionaire and his foolish little plumber girl. You didn't just lie to me, you stole my story and made it about you." He stood there, speechless, because he knew she was right. His lie, his fear, his world, it had all come crashing down on her, and it had buried her. "Nora, please," he begged, his own voice cracking. "Let me fix this. I'll do anything." "You can't fix this," she said, her voice now a hollow, broken whisper. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, a gesture of such profound defeat that it shattered his heart. "I need to go. I need space. I can't be your plumber anymore. And I don't think I can be anything else either." She turned and walked to the door, her steps heavy. "Nora, don't do this," he pleaded, his voice raw with a desperation he had never known. "Don't walk away from me." She paused at the door, her back to him. "I'm not walking away from you, River," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm walking away from whatever this is, this lie, this game, because it stopped being fun a long time ago." And with that, she was gone. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing through the vast, silent penthouse. River Grant stood alone in the middle of his glass kingdom, surrounded by all the wealth and power in the world, and for the first time in his life, he was utterly and completely bankrupt. For 3 days, River Grant's penthouse felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the city he owned, but no longer felt a part of. He'd canceled all his meetings. He hadn't spoken to his family. He just sat in the vast, empty living room, the echo of Nora's final words playing on a loop in his head. "I can't be your plumber anymore, and I don't think I can be anything else either." He had built an empire on the principle of control, of always being 10 steps ahead. But he had played one game too many, and in trying to protect his heart, he had lost it completely. "Sir?" Arthur appeared at his side, holding a tablet with a worried expression. "Your father has called 7 times, and Mrs. DeWitt's article has been picked up by the Associated Press. It's national news now." River didn't even flinch. He just stared out the window, at the millions of lights representing millions of lives he couldn't connect with. He had everything, and he had nothing. "Arthur," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "get me an interview, live, with Sarah Jenkins." Arthur blinked, stunned. Sarah Jenkins was the toughest, most respected journalist on television. She was known for dismantling politicians and CEOs with a polite smile. "Sir, are you certain? Our PR team strongly advises against." "I'm not asking for PR advice," River said, finally turning to face his assistant, a fire in his eyes that had been missing for days. "I'm not going to hide anymore. I made this mess in public. I'm going to fix it in public." He stood up, a new, terrifying resolve on his face. "Get me the interview. And Arthur, no talking points, no script, just a camera, a chair, and me." 2 nights later, River sat across from Sarah Jenkins, the bright studio lights feeling like an interrogation lab. Millions of people were watching. He knew Nora was probably watching too. That was the only audience that mattered. "Mr. Grant," Sarah began, her voice smooth and professional, "the last few days have been a whirlwind of speculation. An article has painted you as a manipulative billionaire and a young designer, Nora Wright, as your unwitting victim. What do you have to say to that?" River took a deep breath, ignoring the teleprompter that his PR team had desperately tried to program. He looked directly into the camera. "I'd say the article is wrong," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Nora Wright is not a victim. She was never the victim. I was." Sarah Jenkins raised a single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "You were the victim?" "Yes," River said. "I was a victim of my own fear. For years, I've lived in a world where my last name enters the room before I do, where people see a walking bank account, not a person. I became so cynical, so terrified of being used for my money, that I built a fortress around myself, and I started conducting these ridiculous experiments, posing as someone else to see if I could find a single genuine connection." He leaned forward, his voice full of a raw, painful honesty. "It was a cowardly, selfish, and deeply unfair thing to do, and I am profoundly sorry for it." He paused, then looked straight into the camera again, as if speaking directly to Nora. But then I met her. And she was everything my world wasn't. She was funny and real, and she had this incredible, brilliant mind. He let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. She called me out on my terrible lies. She saw right through my clumsy disguise. She even made me a guide on how not to look poor in fancy places. The studio crew was completely silent, captivated. The greatest irony, he continued, his voice cracking slightly, is that in my arrogant attempt to see if she was real, I was the one who was being fake. The lie wasn't the plumbing. The lie was me thinking I needed to hide to be seen. Nora Wright saw me from the very first minute. Not the plumber, not the billionaire. Just me, and I was too scared to see her back. He took a deep breath, his redemption now complete and public. The article called her a fool. They couldn't be more wrong. Nora Wright is the smartest, sharpest, most perceptive woman I have ever met. She wasn't the one being played. She was the one who was brave enough to play along with the ridiculous game of a lonely, scared man, hoping he'd eventually find the courage to be real. He finished, his heart pounding, his soul laid bare for the world to see. He had given up his most prized possession, his privacy, his control. He had sacrificed his armor. So, Sarah Jenkins said, her voice softer now. To be clear, you're saying she knew all along? I think she's a lot smarter than any of us gave her credit for, he said. Well, you don't have to think, a new voice said from the edge of the set. You can just ask her. Every head in the studio whipped around. There, standing just off camera, was Nora Wright. She was holding a crumpled piece of paper in her hand, and she had that same brilliant, wicked smile on her face that he had fallen in love with. Sarah Jenkins' professional composure finally broke. A slow, stunned smile spread across her face. Ms. Wright, she said, please, join us. Nora walked onto the set, sat down next to River, and looked at him, her eyes sparkling. You know, she said, her voice clear and confident, for a billionaire, you give a pretty good apology. He just stared at her, a wave of hope so powerful it almost knocked him over. Nora, she turned to Sarah Jenkins. Can I just correct the record on one thing? It's all true. I did teach him how to eat pizza with a fork. I did make him a guide on how not to be poor. And yes, he's a terrible plumber. The studio audience, who had been listening in, burst out laughing. But, Nora continued, her expression softening as she looked at River, he wasn't entirely wrong. I knew something was off from the first date. The soft hands, the expensive watch he tried to hide, the fact that he used the word Hopper-esque to describe a photograph. She smiled. I just decided that his story was a lot more interesting than the usual what do you own first date conversation. So I played along. I wanted to see who the man was behind the ridiculous lie. She turned back to the camera, now in complete control. And you know what I found? I found a man who was lonely and kind and surprisingly funny. A man who was carrying the weight of a world I can't even imagine. And yes, I fell in love with him, the plumber and the billionaire, because it turns out they were the same person all along. She reached over and took River's hand. The problem was never the lie, she said, looking him in the eye. It was the fear behind it. The fear that I wouldn't be able to handle your world, and maybe the fear that you wouldn't be able to handle mine. The live broadcast ended with the entire nation in collective, happy tears. Billionaire Plumber was trending worldwide, but this time, it was for all the right reasons. Later that night, River stood at Nora's apartment door. He knocked softly, his heart pounding. When she opened it, they just looked at each other for a long moment, the silence filled with everything that had been said and everything that still needed to be. Can I come in? He asked, his voice a quiet murmur. She smiled and opened the door wider. Her apartment was the same cozy, chaotic, wonderful mess he remembered. So, she said, crossing her arms, a live television confession. That's a pretty dramatic way to ask for a second date. I've learned from the best, he said, a small, hopeful smile on his lips. He held up a folded piece of paper he'd been carrying. And I brought you something. If it's another ticket to a gala, I'm going to have to decline, she teased. It's a contract, he said. Her smile faltered. A contract? Read it, he said, handing it to her. She unfolded the paper. It was printed on simple, plain stock, not his usual corporate letterhead. At the top, it read, Lifetime Partnership Agreement. Between River Grant, the ridiculous billionaire, and Nora Wright, the brilliant designer and part-time detective. Her eyes scanned the clauses, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face as she read. 1. The ridiculous billionaire hereby agrees to a lifetime of honesty, with no more secret identities, fake professions, or plumbing-related lies, unless they are for mutually agreed-upon comedic purposes. 2. The brilliant designer agrees to provide ongoing consultation on how to be a normal human being, including but not limited to the proper use of coupons, the art of cooking pasta that isn't a solid brick, and navigating the complex world of non-billionaires. 3. Both parties agree to a merger. Not of companies, but of lives. To build something real, something honest, and something filled with a ridiculous amount of love and laughter. 4. This contract is binding, eternal, and comes with one final, non-negotiable clause. Nora looked up from the paper, her eyes shining with tears. He was kneeling in front of her, holding out not a ring, but a simple, perfect silver wrench. "Nora Wright," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you be my permanent, lifelong, in-house plumbing consultant?" She was laughing and crying at the same time. "You are the most absurd man I have ever met," she said, pulling him to his feet. "Is that a yes?" he asked, his heart in his eyes. "That's a definite contractual yes," she said and kissed him, sealing their new and very real agreement. 1 year later, the living room of their new home, a beautifully restored brownstone in Brooklyn that Nora had designed from top to bottom, was filled with the happy chaos of a housewarming party. Jessica was arguing with Arthur about the stock market. Mrs. DeWitt was there, now a surprisingly loyal friend, getting a tour of Nora's latest furniture restoration project. River walked in from the kitchen, carrying a tray of champagne glasses. He stopped and just watched his wife as she laughed with her friends, her face alight with a joy that filled every corner of the room. His house was no longer silent. "Hey," he said, walking up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Happy?" "Beyond happy," she said, leaning back against him. Her design firm, which she'd launched with a small, interest-free loan from an anonymous investor, had just been featured in Architectural Digest. "You know," she said, a playful glint in her eye, "the sink in the guest bathroom is making a funny gurgling noise." He smiled, kissing the top of her head. "Don't worry," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. "I'll call a professional." What did you think of the story of River and Nora? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their game of love? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for everyone who has stayed with us until the very end, who believes that true love is worth all the lies and laughter it takes to find it, please comment happily ever after. We are so grateful to share these stories with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that will change the world.